Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelou, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise based in the UK, but with an increasingly large international footprint. We have members across Europe, the USA, Canada, South Africa, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, a few in India as well, and a few in other countries too. And what we're endeavouring to do is to build a community of progressively like-minded people who want the world to be a better place, and in particular, who want the financial services industry to behave in a more transparent, more truthful and trustworthy way. The community itself is now just over 4,000 people. Frankly, we can't cope with the growth that we are experiencing, but we work very hard. Our simple formula for success is to work like the clappers and hope we can cope. And it's just about hanging together. That's the honest truth of the matter. We do all sorts of things to try to bring together two different types of people. On one hand, there are those that we characterize as having a sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see in the world of the financial services industry. And the other group are those that we characterize as having the power and the position to make change possible. This group, of course, includes policymakers, politicians, regulators, powerful leaders of major organizations. These are the people we want to influence. And we always go about our work in an evidence-based way, which means we're not conspiracy theorists, we're not extremists, we're practical, pragmatic, collaboratively minded agents for change who've learned over the last 6 years how to get involved in the system and how to actually make sure that the system works as well as it can do. A key part of our activity is running our events. And for the last 6 months or so, we've been running what we call TTF Film Club sessions. This is where we have a conversation about a movie. This has covered meetings and movies such as The Wolf of Wall Street and many, many others. It's a regular part of our program now because it's becoming increasingly popular. Tonight, as you know, is actually very, very special. It's our first ever live screening. And not only do we have the benefit of a live screening that we'll all be able to watch together, we also have one of the film's producers with us as well, Joel Bakan. I'm going to pass over to Joel in just a few moments and invite Joel to say a few words before we start watching the movie at roughly 10 past, 6:15 UK time. The film lasts for about an hour and 3/4. So the plan is that once I've explained how to go and watch the film, we'll reconvene back on this Zoom link to enable everybody to have a conversation with Joel afterwards and to listen to his thoughts and the thoughts of other people as well. Okay, so that I hope sets the scene quite nicely. Just before I pass over to Joel, I'm going to spend a few moments talking very, very briefly about some of the other events we've got coming up over the next couple of weeks. First of all, I'm going to share with you our groups page. The Transparency Task Force has 25 groups now. We're growing all the time. I'm always creating new groups with the intention of having a community of people focused on this question of what we can do to make the financial sector more transparent, more truthful, and more trustworthy. And as you can probably see, that Margaret Mead quote, that very famous Margaret Mead quotation, really is the very kind of beating heart of the way that the Transparency Task Force thinks and operates. I'll read it out in case you can't see it too well. It says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." We really do believe that to be true. We really do believe that people working together in an unselfish way for a bigger cause can really make a difference because, frankly, commitment and passion really can be quite convincing, especially when we're talking to open-minded policymakers, politicians, regulators, and so on. This spreadsheet is part of our events program organizing activity. And what you can basically see within it, excuse me just a moment, what you can see within it is that here we are today, Monday, July the 12th, the film club, all about the new corporation. You know about that. Tomorrow we have an event covering hot topics in the world of investments. Wednesday, we have an event all about the battle for the control of the digital pound and why it really matters. That's actually also quite an important one. You may or may not know that behind the scenes, there is a lot of activity developing central banks' digital currencies. And our general concern is that there's not enough transparency and not enough dialogue about the way in which this is happening. The worst case scenario is we may all find ourselves with digital currencies linked to central banks that don't really serve society as they ought to. On Thursday, we have a book club session. Robert Delner, a very well-established ambassador of the Transparency Task Force, will be talking about his book, Integral Impact Investment, which is all about how the world of investment can really be a positive force for change. On Tuesday next week, we have Fixing Financial Services with Authentic Communications. In other words, if you're up with the news, doing the dead opposite to what Lloyds Bank got fined, I think it was £90 million for last week, when they issued very misleading promotional activity around some of the general insurance products. And on Wednesday of next week, a very, very important session, if you're into corporate governance, the case for radical reform of the audit profession will be taking a close look at the possibilities of independent audits as a way to break down the inherent conflicts of interest that are very, very often in play in the audit profession. And as you may well be aware, if the audit profession isn't doing its job properly, then the world of corporate governance won't work properly, and we'll very often have all kinds of corporate governance breakdowns of one kind or another. So we'll make sure you get all the information about all of that. I hope you come along to those meetings. But right now, it will be my absolute pleasure to pass over to Joel. We've got to know Joel a little bit over the last few months. Joel's been an absolute pleasure to deal with. Despite his role and frankly his fame, he's been remarkably down to earth and extremely gracious with his time and his understanding of what the TTF is all about, hence this session that we're laying on tonight. So Joel, please do take a few moments to explain what you'd like to say right now. What I'll then be doing, Joel, is I'll be giving everybody the link to access the film and of course the password as well. Over to you, Joel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. It's really been a pleasure to get to know you and to get to know your organization and the important work that it's doing. And I appreciate and I'm grateful to all of you for dropping by for this virtual screening. Some of you may be familiar with a book that I wrote and a film that I made in the early 2000s, 2004, called The Corporation. And it was really at a 10th anniversary screening of that film that it kind of hit me like a brick. I was in the middle of the screening and it was a big celebratory moment, 10 years, blah, 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 champagne, you know, the whole thing. And I thought there's really absolutely nothing to celebrate. Everything we talked about in that film had gotten worse. Climate change was worse, social injustice was worse, corporations were bigger, they were more concentrated, more powerful, controlling more of our lives. Big tech, you know, was now on the scene. Climate change had gone from a crisis to an existential crisis. And at the same time, corporations were claiming that they actually were better, that they'd improved, that they were socially responsible, that they were sustainable. This had become a very sort of large part of the discourse. And I thought, that's all very strange. And so I started to, I'm a legal scholar, that's my sort of day job. And so I started to think about and write about this seeming contradiction. That evolved into a more popular book, which was recently published by Penguin Random House, called The New Corporation, the same as the film title. And while I was writing that book and on the basis of my thinking around the book, I made this documentary film, which is on release in Canada at the moment and will be on commercial release soon in the UK and the US, but you get a sneak preview in Europe as well. I don't know where you're all coming from, but unless you're in Canada, you won't have been able to see this film yet. So here's a sneak preview. I don't really want to say much more about it, other than if you're interested in it and intrigued, you may want to pick up a copy of the book, because in it I'm able to go into more detail and more analysis than one can do in a film. But I thoroughly enjoyed writing and directing this film. Yeah, I really don't want to say much more about it. I'll let you watch it with a fresh mind, and then we can discuss it afterwards. And I look forward to that.
Thank you very much indeed, Joel. I think everybody would like to do what I'd like to do right now, which is to show our appreciation to Joel, not just for writing the book and for producing the film, but for also making it available for us tonight. Thank you very much indeed, Joel.
You're most welcome.
We really do appreciate it massively. Thank you very much. So I'm going to recap on the plan of attack for tonight, folks, because we've had 1 or 2 people join since I explained that a few moments ago. First of all, we're going to watch the film. And the plan is that at roughly 8 o'clock, basically as soon as the film finishes, please rejoin on this Zoom link, okay, on this Zoom link, so that we can hear some further thoughts from Joel, throw around some ideas amongst ourselves, get some reactions, so on and so forth. Okay, folks. Well, I hope you all really enjoyed it. So for those of you that can, please come on screen, come on video. We're going to pass back to Joel now to invite Joel just to say whatever he'd like to say to follow up. And then we'll get a bit of a conversation going, and everyone can take the opportunity to share their thoughts and their insights. For me personally, the big questions are, what do we need to do to get everybody in the world to watch that documentary? That's what I'd like. If we could have a magic wand, that'd be one thing I'd really like. And if we can't get everybody in the world to watch it, what can we do to get the teenagers to watch it? The youngsters, the people coming through, the people who aren't so kind of contaminated with the status quo and so invested in the status quo that they might actually have an appetite to do something. Loads of questions come off the back of this documentary for me. That's why it's so important. That's why I'm so grateful that we've got Joel here to reflect on his thoughts. Joel, sir, over to you. Please speak for as long as you can. I know everybody that's here is very interested in what you have to say, Joel. So there's no time in it. Just go for it, sir. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think I'm most interested to hear what everybody else has to say. In a way, you've just spent the last hour and 40 minutes listening to me as the writer and co-director of the film. So you've kind of got my argument there, an argument that, as I said before, I make sort of in more detail and more, I guess, somewhat more scholarly, though still readable, way in the book. I guess what I can say, I mean, just picking up on Andy's point about people seeing this film, as an academic, I became frustrated in the late 1990s with what was a contradiction between, on the one hand, wanting to do work that made a difference in the world, and on the other hand, speaking to a handful of experts in my field. And that's kind of what drove me from the usual scholarly ivory tower. And I still do that kind of work, but it made me want to translate that work into media that would reach broader audiences of non-specialists, of young people. And I'd always enjoyed film. And so that was one piece of it. And the other was to start writing books that actually were what are called trade books that would sort of go out to a much broader public than usual academic books. So these works that you've just engaged with, the film and my books as well, and the other film and my other books, are what I consider to be works in translation. They're based on a lot of tough research and scholarly slogging, and coming up with arguments and ideas, but then translating those into media that can have an emotional impact and that can have a broad and accessible impact rather than just a scholarly impact. So that's what I attempt to do. The extent to which I succeed, is really up to you. But that's the attempt. It's always a very unsettling place to be, because the scholar in me is looking at the work and thinking, oh, it's not rigorous enough. And the entertainer in me is looking at the work and thinking, oh, it's not entertaining enough, or it's too much of a downer, or it doesn't have a happy ending, or whatever. So I'm always kind of perched on that ledge between those two things. It's an uncomfortable place to be, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you just experienced. And I see there's a hand up. I'll leave it to Andy to moderate.
Thank you, Joel. I will. In a moment, we're going to go to Gareth Stears to get his initial thoughts. Gareth's our head of TTF Film Club. I'd like to just sort of set out the way the documentary made me feel. There are parts of it where I felt very, very, very sad, flat, depressed. And I guess that's a pretty natural reaction given how stark some of the information is and how shocking some of the practices are that the documentary outlines so well. There were other bits where I felt angry. I felt like I didn't want to tolerate this anymore, especially when I started thinking about my kids and hopefully one day their kids and what the world will be like in 50 years or so. There's this kind of sense of, we must do something about this, and how do we do it? So you go through this kind of, it's almost like different sort of stages of emotional response to the film. For me personally, I end up in a place of feeling very determined to do whatever I can to try to make a teeny tiny difference in my little sphere of influence. And I think the documentary works, Joel, because I think its ultimate purpose must be to try to share this knowledge and insight in such a way that it motivates people to do something about it. And it makes me think about our democratic systems and what needs to happen to change them, and how do we get real dynamic democracy that properly serves society. I always come away from your work with loads of thoughts in my head. Some of it's a bit jumbled up, and it takes time to kind of let it all settle into some coherent argument. But the overriding thought is, what can we do with what we now know that we didn't know before watching it? And what can we do to get more people to watch it? That's basically where I'm going with it. Gareth, please introduce yourself. Gareth, explain why you are TTF's head of film club, and share your thoughts, please. Then we'll go to everybody else that's got their hand up. Thanks, Gareth.
Thanks, Andy. Yes, my name's Gareth. My day job's in the pensions industry, which is how I came across the Transparency Task Force. But when I was at university, I didn't study pensions or anything financy. I studied film studies. And actually, while I was studying film studies at university, I think it was around that time, that was when I first watched The Corporation, the first film. And that was actually our last film club. I don't know if you know Joel, and when we were advertising that, I did share that The Corporation had a big effect on me. And it stayed with me, I realized, all these years. And I think perhaps this film will as well. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. If enjoys the right word, actually, because like Andy, I think I spent most of it feeling quite angry and worried about the future, but you did drag me back at the end, so thanks for that. I think the bits that really got to me, I don't know about anyone else, but are sort of the parts of the film which make you think about the sort of dystopian future we might face if things don't change. In particular, when you see corporations teaching children, it makes me think, what's on the curriculum? Are they ever going to teach anything to these kids which might threaten corporations, or is there just going to be indoctrination? So that obviously worries me a lot as well, and also anything to do with sort of algorithms controlling our lives, and if you fall on the wrong side of an algorithm, you might never be able to get a job for no good reason other than an algorithm doesn't like the cut of your chip. That sort of thing scares me very much as well. So yeah, really enjoyed the movie, again, if that's the right word, and yeah, I'll pass on to others because I can see at least 3 people have got their hands up.
Thank you very much, Gareth. And obviously, Joel, just every now and then we'll pause and check in with you, Joel, to get your further thoughts based on what others have said. I'm going to go to Stuart's not actually got his hand up, but Stuart's really into the sorts of things that this movie covers off so well, Stuart. So, Stuart, could you please just introduce yourself and share your insights and the work that you do about the tensions within companies that you talk to about, on one hand, talking a good game about making change happen, but on another hand, them not actually walking the talk, so to speak, if I can put it so bluntly.
Sure. Thanks, Andy, for putting me on the spot. I'll do my best. Yeah, I'm Stuart Woolard. I run, co-founded a not-for-profit organisation called the Maturity Institute, and I run a commercial arm of that institute. We essentially developed a methodology which sits alongside credit ratings. In fact, we designed it with a Standard & Poor's affiliate company, which is rating the health of organizations in human terms, essentially. And we're rating organizations on the value and risk that they create through all their sort of human stakeholders, so workers, suppliers, customers, citizens, and so on and so forth. So, the film resonates very strongly in that regard. I guess one of the first things that we rate, we use a diagnostic which has 32 questions, and question 1 is around corporate purpose, and question 2 is how does an organization define and manage value? And what came out of the film is that very strongly, which is most organizations are still rooted in a profit motive, still rooted in a default position of delivering shareholder value, which tends to be delivering earnings in a very short-term time horizon. And obviously a lot of the pressures of doing that, and certainly, in a 50-year paradigm, building systems and structures around that, and also society defining success, on that terms, creates a situation where, it's all about the money. And I think that the film, starts to talk about is that, we're all demanding something different, and organizations who truly are able to serve society. And I guess, where we come from, one of the things that we're trying to highlight is that this idea that there is a trade-off between profit, people, and planet is not actually true. There are a small number of organizations, and they're growing, where we can create a mutually inclusive value system where everyone can benefit, and clearly we have to move away from a system which is perpetuating organizations that act in accordance for the very few, and are largely built on a system where the exploitation of resources, be they human or environmental, is no longer acceptable. And I think we're seeing very clearly, if we don't act absolutely critically quickly, then things are gonna go south, extremely quickly. It was interesting, our work, certainly our recent work, and I was just saying to Andy at the start of this conversation, we've been in dialogue with some very CEOs of big organizations, and the extent to which there's, are these organizations interested in changing? Is there an authenticity around, CEOs and the C-suite about saying we have to be different, we have to change the nature of who we are, can we move away from simply corporate, sort of corporate social responsibility to be embedding social purpose such that we're effectively truly serving society, and can we still generate value in the sort of financial value we have done, and that's been a very interesting dialogue. I mean, I think there are some organizations that have started that transition. Some think they're a lot further down the line than they are, but most are still stuck, and some, and I think the JP Morgan Jamie Dimon was interesting. Some there's a lot of greenwash out there, and there's a lot of organizations that are saying that they are They are different when the reality is that they're not. I'm a naive optimist, and I think that keeps me going, because otherwise I think we'd all give up. In the sense that I think that there's enough change going on at grassroots level. I think there's enough change within the investment sector. I think there's enough change through people like Andy and the TTF and organisations like his. And we increasingly need to work in partnership and ally with each other, because I think that's the only way we're going to really change the system, because the system has to change. We have to change business schools. We have to change audit, the way accountancy works. We have to change how we measure success, and what we think, how organizations should create value, and what that value should look like. That it's an enormous systems change, because we've built something that's been in place for many decades as the film comes out. I think, in short, as I said to Andy, I think, it is depressing, but it also fires me up. And I think we can, I'm more hopeful than I was 5 years ago when we really started to get traction around our work. I think we are seeing some change, but it has to be change across a number of different actors within the whole system. So, is that enough, Andy? Is that enough?
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We'll go to Donna, then to Michael, then to Hatay. And forgive me if I haven't pronounced your name correctly, Hatay. Donna, please share your thoughts. And after we've gone to Donna, Michael, and Hatay, we'll jump back into Joel's further thoughts. Donna, over to you. Thank you very much. Please start off by introducing yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, hi. I've recently come on to TTF to help Andy out with the PR side. I have a bit of a long history in financial services. I actually walked out at the end of 2008 and discussed calling it a self-enriching cabal. And I think I've been spending the rest of that time sort of semi-retirement and trying to find myself and trying to stop getting angry. It was really, I loved the film, Joel. In fact, I wrote lots of notes because, sorry, this is me. I like taking notes. And everything that was on there, it was almost like it condensed almost everything that I'd been seeing over, sort of many decades and getting angrier and angrier about. And I'm coming at this from a very female point of view, is that it's all about human behavior. I mean, if you look throughout history, we keep repeating ourselves and in many ways. And in these corporations, it's like you have to get into the mindset of the people at the top. They think they're doing good, but actually it's more about, I see it as their self-interest overtakes the wider interest. And one of the things that they fail to notice is that what they're doing is biting the hand that feeds them. And at some point that will break down. And unless they take on board that message, when I was hearing about the automation, etc., I was like, that will break down in the end, because if you automate the teachers, you automate everything else, then what are you going to do with all the people? And how are you going to pay for the stuff that you're trying to flog? Because there comes an end point. If it's like there's a story of the crown of thorn starfish that eat up the barrier reefs, and they get to a point where they've eaten all the coral and they die out, and then they sort of rise up again. It's the same sort of behavior. So it's like looking at tackling that. And one of the things is that I get exhausted by the rhetoric and the narratives that are around. And I know that there's change, but one of the things I worry about, if I look at sort of the tech bros and the Bitcoin people and that, I'm going to say they usually come with bollocks attached. And that's something, so that behavior is still there. It's like the wannabe king or prince. And because of the way that the corporate structures are, if we don't tackle that and we don't start to sort of hold the mirror up to their behavior, we could find ourselves not being able to change. So we have to stand up to that. And I think one of the things we need to educate people on is in the way their languaging as well, to call out their bullshit instead of being intimidated by it. Because I'm quite scared just now in the UK and the current government. and the way that they manipulate people. And it's also, you know, the constant sort of, you know, confrontational language that they use as well. So I think we need to get to that to really make change. So, I'm going off point there. And the other thing, there's one last point, was Andy said, how to get this out to lots of people, particularly younger people. I actually sent a friend a text. She's got a 17-year-old daughter. She's also got a niece who's 17, and I just said, this film is awesome, everybody should see it, Eve would love it, I hope I can share it. And I think your content and the pace of it is fantastic, and I can imagine a lot of young people really loving it. So I want to know, how do we share it? And I think if we all do that and get it out to as many people as possible, that's a start.
Donna, thank you very much indeed. We're going to go quickly to Michael, then to Hate. I'm also going to ask Catherine Knox to verbalise the question, the very good question that she put in the chat as well. So Catherine, if you're happy to speak to that question in a moment. But first of all, let's go to Michael. Michael, nice and succinctly, if you can, what are your thoughts, please?
Well, I agree with everything that was just said. It's wonderful, and you know, so I'm sorry I'm joining you from a park in Toronto, you know, I think the thing where the film is ending is sort of an interesting point, where it's like, well, one of the solutions to this is to get involved in politics, run for office, and start using the institutions of checks and balances in politics for the purposes for which they are intended. We've come through a period that the film describes that also has seen, like, you know, very low voter participation, very low engagement in politics, like a lot of disengagement with these structures and these institutions that were designed and built and are supposed to be operated in order to address the issues and the problems that are being discussed, right? And this goes back to the French Revolution, the Polish Constitution, the American Revolution, these are the timeframes we're dealing with. And, you know, power always needs checks and balances and constraints. And these are the institutions we have to do that. And so and having been involved a little bit in both Occupy and Maidan and Kyiv, it was extremely disappointing to see Occupy not register anybody to vote, not translate that into a political platform, not engage with a political party, like just not engage in the process at all. And then you see Maidan like successfully take down KGB, right? One of the most successful social movements in European history, because they are politically active and engaged and using what rule of law that there is to do that. So what to do next, I think in general, and get people engaged in voting, right? You can't score goals if you're not on the pitch. Get them to run. And for an audience like this, more specifically, many sites, S-I-T-E, of politics are not just electoral politics. It's our regulators, it's our accounting standards, it's our reporting standards in the financial markets, which are kind of technical and often out of sight, out of mind for many activists and for many even electoral people interested in electoral politics. But this audience should be aware and get involved in writing opinions like we're doing for regulators, or lobbying the accounting agents, the accounting standards boards for improvements, because there's a lot of action, there's a lot of leverage on sort of the global capitalist system that where there are mechanisms for us to participate and to contribute that are poor, I find in my impression, just poorly used. And you have to show up at these places, otherwise, no one's going to say anything, no one's going to. So that's my thoughts. Congratulations, Joel, by the way. Love it.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Could I please invite, where have you gone? Catherine Knox to share her comment, or his question rather, that's in the chat. So Catherine, if you're happy to, please do turn your question in the chat into a verbal question for Joel to respond to. Thank you very much.
Hi there, thank you very much. Yeah, I really enjoyed the film. Just for a bit of context, I work for a funding body in the UK that funds work on corporate accountability. So just in relation to the last comment made, one of the projects we've recently just had an application on is about looking at those economic service providers and how they're facilitating corporate malpractices. So yeah, interested to hear that comment. My point in the chat was, saying that, in your film, you sort of show this shift to political activism from the sort of despairing picture of how bleak it all is. And I guess my thought on this was just, or my question on this is like, how can we really make that shift move? We've got, not enough, I would suggest, movement in the political system, in democracy, to really make the transitions we need to make that kind of leap of change to change the situation we're in. And even if we look at the threat you major on of climate change, which is an existential threat, we still can't seem to make the kind of transitions we need to. I just wondered what your thoughts are on that. And I suppose also in the context of the pandemic, the pandemic has really thrown our world out in a way we haven't seen for many years. And has that helped us move forward for the better, do you think, or opened up opportunities, or shut them down? And I guess, in the UK context, for instance, I feel our democracy has really been moving backwards. Our parliament hasn't been operating properly. The media's been focused on COVID to the extent that other things for many months weren't even in the news. So it just feels like we're in a really, really difficult place. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts on how we kind of make more of a leap forward, if you like.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. Very, very well put. Let's go back to Joel to reflect on some of the points made by Catherine and Stuart and everyone that's just spoken. Plus, of course, anything else that you'd like to share with us, Joel. Back to you.
I mean, these are really large questions, and let me begin with Stuart's comments. And I am very heartened by the work that's going on among people within the business community and around the business community to try, like Stuart and like others among you, to try to get corporations to be better, to try to get them to be more human, to try to get them to not sacrifice people and planet for the sake of profit. But I think one of the messages of all of my work is that it's not just a question of people being better or nicer or companies being better, that it has to do with a variety of structural factors, rules of the game that we work within. And that until those rules change, and those aren't rules internal to a company's governance, those are the macro rules, our legal rules and principles, the ones that bind us, the ones that constitute corporations, that create regulatory systems, that decide whether schools can be run by corporations or they have to be in the public sphere. Until we change those, I'm not sure that there's a lot of room to move. So the space that Stuart's working within, and many other people who I greatly admire and respect, is a space that in many ways, because of the structure of corporations, has to find synergies among people, planet, and profit. They can't say to a company that they're advising or that they're criticizing, we think that your shareholders should sacrifice themselves, or you should sacrifice them for the sake of people and planet. They can say, we think you should sacrifice them in the short term, but there always has to be an argument about some benefit to shareholders in the long term, because that is what companies are legally constituted to do in terms of how they're currently constituted. And when we're working within a capitalist system, and don't get all scared, I'm not going to suggest we shouldn't be, but I'm going to try to create a slightly more nuanced understanding of capitalism. Capitalism is, if you just take the word literally, suggests the ism is the creation of capital. I mean, let's just start there. And that is how corporations are legally constituted. They're constituted to create capital. Now, we can ask them to try to do a nicer job and a better job and be more human and all of that. But we always have to make an argument to them that the reason we're asking you to be more human or be nicer or be better to the environment is because in the end, that's going to help you in your fundamental legally created mission to produce capital. So that is the kind of box, and that's where I sense frustration in Stuart and in some others, because you're working in a space in a way that has these boundaries, where we have to find ways that we can tell corporation to do well by doing good, or to find win-win solutions. But we can't say that you shouldn't be putting doing well as your primary obligation, because they're not going to listen to that, and nor can they legally listen to that. And nor within a capitalist system where capital is the ism, can we say that that shouldn't be our fundamental goal. And any corporation that said that they were going to sacrifice shareholder value in a real, genuine, long-term way for the sake of people and planet would very quickly lose their shareholders, go bankrupt, lose the banks that are financing them. They couldn't exist. They would die. And capitalism as a whole would die if the rules suddenly in one day changed and said, hey, we don't have to creating capital isn't the goal anymore. So the way I like to think about capitalism is more like, how can we have a democratic society that has markets and corporations within it, rather than how can we have democracy within capitalism, which is kind of how we think about it too often. How can we have a democratic society where corporations are used as the tools they were created to be? They're marvelous vehicles for raising large pools of capital. That's what they were created to do, the modern corporation in the mid-19th century, finance railroads. That's what they were created for. Because what they do, unlike the partnership form that preceded them, is they allow an infinite number of people to contribute either a small or medium or large amount of capital to a project. So if you have a railroad or a factory or a steamship line, because now we have steam engines, and so now we can create mass industry, now we need mass pools of capital, so now we need the corporate form which enables us to do that. Fantastic tool. Markets, amazing tool. I don't want my sneakers to be made by the state. I'm not in favor of communism. I don't want that. I think we need a thriving private sector. We need markets. They're amazing tools to promote human good. What's happened, though, is that we've become turned upside down and sideways. Somehow markets and corporations have become ends rather than means. Somehow we've become the means to serve them rather than them to serve us. And my worry about the movement to try to make corporations better, and the reason why the subtitle of my book is How Good Corporations Are Bad for Democracy, my worry is, and I learned this when I was in Davos, and you see it in the interview with Richard Edelman, and this gets back to, I think, Catherine's point about why are we not, and Michael's point, why are we not embracing politics? Part of the reason is, I think, one of the narratives, to get back to Donna's point about these sort of false narratives, or pardon me, bullshit, as she called them, one of the narratives out there, and this was the narrative that I really felt strongly when I was going around Davos and talking to all the very smart people there, is we're going into a post-democracy stage. Wow. That, I mean, this is what people like Klaus Schwab, like Jamie Dimon, like Richard Edelman, this is what they say when you really push them. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But we're going into a post-democracy phase where it's clear that democracy is failing. It's clear government is no longer working. I mean, look around the world and find me a government that everybody says, wow, that's great. We love what they're doing. So the takeaway in Davos is democracy is not working. So what we need now is a more benevolent business sector to govern, to run schools, to run water systems, and in a totally, I'm not saying intentional way, but in a structural way. The whole movement to make corporations better is actually pushing or helping push in that direction, to say, no, we don't really need government regulation because corporations will be better and they'll voluntarily regulate themselves in ways that protect all these stakeholder interests. So yeah, we can roll back taxes, we can roll back regulation, we can let corporations run schools because they're better now. So when I was interviewing Richard Edelman, he really, now, Richard Edelman is probably you've all heard of him, I'm sure. He's the lead sort of corporate guru in the world, the chief prognosticator of the corporate world. And a wonderful guy. And always seen as kind of at the leading edge of the purpose movement, of the good corporation movement. And so I interviewed him, and he said in the interview, you saw him in the film, it's in the book in more detail, but he said, corporations are really becoming they're becoming good actors now. And these are his own words. He said, they're filling the voids left by government. And that was like, oh, well, that's a big kind of concept. And so I pushed back with the question. I said, well, yeah, okay, they're filling the voids left by government, they're becoming better, but what happens to democracy in that scenario? Because we may love, corporations may be great at doing a lot of things. So let's forget about whether we like them, whether we hate them, whether we think they're good, whether we think they're bad. They're not democratic. We can all agree on that. They don't have any democratic accountability, except to the extent that regulators who do tell them what to do and what not to do. But they themselves have no democratic accountability except to their own shareholders. And those are not citizens. So Richard, if they're filling voids left by government, shouldn't we be worried if we care about democracy? And his response was what you see in the film. And I quote him directly, I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship. I believe in the power of the marketplace. So right there, to me, that and that was the idea that the whole sort of good corporation movement that I was seeing in Davos, they were all saying that in one way or another. Klaus Schwab, when I sat down and interviewed him, was saying that. So to me, that's a very scary idea, because when we look at Catherine's comment, when we look at Michael's comment, when we look at Donna's comment, what they're saying is, Michael said, Occupy, they didn't get on a political sort of program. And I agree with him. In my book, I go into a lot more detail. Two of the people you saw in the film, Shama Sawant from Seattle and Agathangelou, the mayor of Barcelona, were both Occupy activists. Agathangelou, the Los Indignados and the M15 movement in Spain, Shama Sawant, Occupy in the United States. And both of them had the same narrative. They both said to me, it was when we were sitting in the squares and in the streets in Seattle and in Barcelona that we realized we can shout until the cows come home. It's not going to make any difference. We need to get political, which is why they both ran for political office. So there's a really interesting narrative there that kind of picks up on Michael's point, where a lot of the kind of contemporary, more inventive and progressive democratic politicians around the world actually come out of those movements. And so it's actually a happier story than it appears on the surface. And Michael White talks about that a little bit in the film, one of the organizers of Occupy. So I guess what I'm saying is there is this interesting problem where the very notion that we can rely upon corporations to voluntarily become better, to have better audit systems, better ESG, more human leaders, all of that stuff, in a way creates a promise that I don't think can be realized because of the nature, at least, of publicly traded corporations. And not only does it create a promise that can't be realized, but it also suggests that we should put our energies there rather than in the sphere of democratic politics. And so it's part of, in some ways, what may be unwittingly eroding our commitments to democracy on the ground, because when the leaders of the new corporation movement say, I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship, we should be deeply worried and disturbed.
Wow. Fantastic, Joel. Thank you very much. There's a bit of a theme developed in the chat. I'm going to invite Alex Farley-Winter to, if Alex can speak, if your daughter's not making too much noise with you there. Alex, please talk about the section 172 point, and then perhaps if Con Keating can speak to that section 172 point as well. Alex, are you able to speak? If not, I'll
Yeah, sort of. She keeps piping up. She was just piping up again, being like, "No, be a T-Rex now." Sorry, I can't. Got my 3-year-old here. Yes, I've done a bit on corporate, basically conflicts for DSMOG, who are great on some of the environmental like contradictions and the battles between sort of environmental activists at and established kind of shareholder interests at AGMs and attempts to get sort of corporate governance changed to recognize climate risk as an existential risk, including for large businesses, that kind of thing. But yeah, it's been pointed out to me before that basically corporate law just kind of needs changing at a fundamental level to recognize stakeholder interests on an equal value, on an equal standing with everything else. And yeah, and the other, yeah, I just wondered what you thought of that as a legal scholar and a filmmaker. And also, your film really reminded me of An Insignificant Man, about grassroots politics in India as well. So yeah, I just wanted to shout out for that film as well. It's a very powerful kind of documentary about grassroots politics.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you. We're going to go to Con Keating, if Con's happy to elaborate on this section 172 point, and then to Corinne Carr, who also put something in the chat about that as well. So Con, if you're happy to just succinctly share your thoughts about section 172, what do you think about it? Is it a blocker? Is it an enabler? What needs to happen in your opinion, Con? And please kick off with a brief intro as well. Thank you very much.
Well, I've just been around since forever. Section 172 deals with corporate responsibilities. It's a vast, this is of the Companies Act 2006. It's a vast improvement in terms of outlining where responsibilities may lie, particularly, for example, to the more obvious stakeholders in a company, such as the employees. There's a list of, I think it's 8 or 9 items and areas which are perfectly valid by way of an approach to widening corporate responsibility, or if you like, actually making the corporation, the personhood of the corporation, closer to that of a real person. The problem with section 172 is actually in the initial wording of all of those items which are subsequently listed, because all section 172 requires directors to do is to have regard to all of those things. And that's such a beautifully woolly and useless statement that you can do whatever the fuck you want to. Not to put too fine a point on it. What I would suggest is there's a lot of work, and I mean a lot of work, being going on this stuff. Look up Frank Bold, B-O-L-D, which is a law firm in Belgium, who have been doing an awful lot of work on the role of the corporation. You've also got the work of Margaret Blair and Bill Lazonick, all of which are worth reading. If you want a quick idiot's crib to how we might make companies contribute to, well, both be more sustainable and contribute to the sustainability of our world, I suggest that you download the paper that I referenced in the chat.
Thank you, Con. Thank you very much indeed. And let's go to Corinne with her thoughts about section 172. And Corinne, if you don't mind, please kick off a little bit of an introduction to yourself so that people understand your focus as an advisor to corporates around incentives and that kind of thing. Thanks, Corinne.
Yeah, hi Andy, and hi everyone. Yeah, a bit of intro. So I'm a remuneration consultant, and I specialize in an area which is called responsible reward, the integration of sustainability and remuneration. So more specifically, looking at ESG and extra financial measures in incentives, but not just incentives, the whole pay packet from pay, bonuses, benefits, and pension. I don't pretend to be a corporate governance specialist, but I just put there the extract of section 172, and I can see what the gentleman before me meant when he said having regard to, because it clearly says that in the chat box. So it's obviously not enough, and it can be interpreted as one might wish to do so. I mean, my view is that until we link some of these, high topics to the way that people are being paid, then I think very little progress is going to be made. And that's the point I'm taking. It's a shame, but that's the reality.
Thank you very much indeed, Corinne. There's that famous Charlie Munger quote I refer to quite a bit. Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. Incentives really clearly do have such a huge impact on what actually happens. We're going to go to Michael Savant in the US. Then we'll go back to Joel to reflect on anything you'd like to. Then we'll go to Gareth and Stuart. Michael, I'm sure you're going to bring a different perspective into this conversation, talking about the money system itself. So Michael, please share your thoughts. Thank you.
Sure, and I just put in my name and contact information, as well as a couple of key links in the chat box there. Joel, for more than a decade, we've been doing research into economic development issues. And about 3 years ago, we stumbled onto the idea that at the core of so many of the problems of society is the he who issues and controls money. You talked about capital, and what's behind capital is money. And that the first link that I put in there, that YouTube one, is a video that was put out by the Bank of England acknowledging that the vast majority of money in circulation is created by banks when they make loans. And so much of our entire financial ecosystem is all tied up with the idea of, who creates money, who controls money. And what we have evolved from there is the idea, well, following the advice of Bucky Fuller, you don't try and change a paradigm from inside it, you go create a parallel one and replace it. And so we've developed the whole idea that we, the people, can create our own money and essentially start defining an entire new ecosystem. And that goes in parallel with all the other things that your film was talking about today. But that represents a way that citizens today can do something at the grassroots level and is in their own direct control. And it feeds right into the, a lot of the desires and movement that's out there. So as Andy knows, this is something I've been putting to, in front of the transparency folks for a while. I'm one of the ambassadors and so on. And so there's an article following that YouTube one that I put in. If anybody's interested in drilling into and understanding the ideas of where money actually comes from, and then what the alternatives are about that, that's that research money link that I put in there. I think that's enough for Andy.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael. Thank you. So let's just let's jump back to Joel. Then after that, we're going to go to Gareth and Stuart, and we'll have one more sort of final round before we wrap up quite shortly. It's been a fantastic conversation on top of an awesome documentary. It really has. Joel, back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for all the really thoughtful comments. And yeah, Section 172, I'm well aware of. And here in Canada, we have similar legal norms as a result of a Supreme Court of Canada decision interpreting our sort of best interests of the corporation rule and corporate law. And in the US, there are various kinds of what are called stakeholder statutes that similarly provide a discretion, but not an obligation to take account of ESG phenomenon. So we see this throughout the law. And, the duty of the director is to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole, to do what in good faith is most likely to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members. And in doing so, have regard, for me, is really important language, but equally important is the language right before that, which is promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole. Its members are its shareholders. A corporation is a legal entity that takes all the individual shareholders and turns them into a collective entity, and they are its members. So its primary obligation is to promote for the benefit of its members. That is its legal obligation. And the rest, as Con pointed out, is fairly fluffy what they can take account of in doing that. Even if it said, though, that they had to take account of those things, the ultimate teleology, the ultimate beneficiary is the membership, are the shareholders. And those other things are all just things that they either can or they have to take account of in changing that. We have B corporations as well. In the book, I go into a lot of detail about all of this. And the basic argument, if I can just summarize it, is that the problem with keeping capitalism as it is and just tweaking the constitution, the legal constitution of the corporation, is that it will never be tweaked to the point where it abandons the fundamental mission of large publicly traded corporations within capitalism, which is, remember, the purpose of a corporation is to raise capital. That's what it's supposed to be doing. And it is not going to be able to raise capital unless it can tell those who contribute to it, its shareholders and investors, that they will get a return on their money. You know, nobody is going to invest. If you want to do something good for the planet, you'll give your money to a charity. If you're putting your money and your pension money, for example, into a corporation, it is essential that you get a return. That's why you're doing it. That's what the corporation is about. And so the problem is that lawmakers, so long as we're working within that system, lawmakers can't create a sort of DNA of the corporation that is going to abandon that ultimate teleology, that ultimate goal of creating wealth for investors. Because as soon as it does that, investors won't invest. So investors are happy if a corporation tries to be better for the environment and society in serving them, but they're not happy if the corporation stops serving them. They will take their money and go elsewhere. And they include not just retail investors, but banks and finance houses. So essentially what I argue in the book is that the entire system of capitalism as we know it would come to a grinding halt if all of a sudden section 172 subsection A said, oh, and by the way, the duty on directors is to serve the planet and people. And if there's a bit left over for shareholders, fine, but if not, too bad. If it said that, capitalism would come to a grinding halt. Banks would fail. We'd go into a massive depression. So I don't see that as the first step in change, which is why the film unfolds as the way it does. The other way that we can do this is to say, okay, corporations are going to be pretty well what they are. Their job is to raise capital, so they're going to have to create incentives for investors to invest. But what we can do is we can regulate them. We can create rules that ensure that the trade-offs between public good and public harm are ones that our democracy says are okay, and are ones that ensure a sustainable planet, and are ones that ensure workers aren't unduly exploited, that human rights are respected, and all of that. That's what regulation is. And we can ensure that we have inspectors. We can ensure that we have tribunals. We can ensure that we have all of the apparatus and infrastructure of the state to make sure corporations are doing what they legally are required to do. When you look at what section 172, you know, as Khan again pointed out, as a lawyer, I see zero. I see zilch. There's no inspection. There's no right for anybody to go in and make sure the director did what the director's supposed to do. In good faith simply means you're not doing it in bad faith. So it doesn't mean very much. You know, there is absolutely nothing legally there that has any tangibility at all, let alone any enforcement structure, any assessment, any oversight, any tribunal, nothing. So basically what we're doing when we create a 172 is we're delegating to the corporation to regulate itself in accordance with very fluffy standards. And that then becomes a legitimation strategy for deregulating that other kind of regulation with inspectors, with oversight, and with tribunals. So all of it pushes in that direction. Again, that's why I say that, you know, the good corporation is bad for democracy, the subtitle of my book, because what all of this is doing is saying there are two paths to making a better world. One of them is we have a robust democratic regulatory state. that taxes, that regulates, that redistributes, and that makes sure the environment doesn't lead to a planet that burns up. The other way is to delegate it all to directors with some fluffy standards and some nice words about you guys should be better than you've been, and some ESG audits and all of that, and some seminars on how to be nice to workers and how to be inclusive. And what I'm suggesting is, while those two are not necessarily at odds with each other, in terms of the ideological space we're moving through at the moment, one is being used against the other. And that's my real fear, that the 172 and the stakeholder capitalism and all of this is being used as an argument, and successfully, to drive back the regulatory state. And that really worries me. And somebody mentioned the pandemic earlier and whether any good or bad will come from it. I think, we'll need a bit more history before we know. But I think one thing that I see is a Biden administration, for example, that's being a lot more robust in some of these things I'm talking about in regulation and taxation of corporations. That's actually following some of the ideas that I talk about at the end of my book as the way forward, taking some leaves from taking some pages from the books of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, the AOCs of the world. I mean, you're starting to see a rejuvenation of this kind of Roosevelt or Adelaide in the UK kind of idea that markets are great, corporations are great, but it's up to democracy and democratic governments to set the rules they play by, not up to themselves to set their own rules or fluffy standards like 172.
Thank you so much. We're going to go to Robert Ashford in the States. Robert, if I could please invite you to be as straightforward and as succinct as you can be. I know your work is very advanced and very progressive. And then I'm going to invite a couple of my colleagues. We have Kerry and Robert with us. They're interns working at TTF, and I'd be delighted to hear youngsters' perspectives on what's been seen and discussed tonight. So Robert and Kerry, please get yourselves ready to make one or two points if you'd like to. But first we'll go to Robert over in the States. Robert, please introduce yourself and make your points as straightforwardly and as succinctly as you can. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Andy. First of all, I'm very impressed with this group and very grateful to Andy for his wonderful work. This is obviously an important cutting edge to the future. Just a couple of pieces of background for me. I teach corporate law. I understand corporate finance, and my undergraduate degree is in physics, so I'm not math shy. A lot of the comments here are very important. I have the opportunity with Andy's invitation to make a presentation later on, which will take much more time than I have here. I do want to say that having heard all the people here, and in all due respect, I think another part of the problem, particularly with finance, economics, and democracy and sustainability, is that we are working with a flawed understanding of economics. Starts with Adam Smith, goes through Marx, Marshall, Walras, Keynes, all the Nova. That we're making a fundamental error. So I can both agree with Joel that the corporation has a duty to maintain its long-term sustainability, which is best measured in conventional terms in terms of share value. But I disagree that the good corporation is an enemy of democracy. I think a good corporation is a part of the solution to democracy in the post-industrial world. I will give it, to cut short, I'm going to try to simply give you a principle that did not appear in any written language in the world until probably 15 years ago. And that is that a broader distribution of real capital acquisition with the future earnings of capital creates the rational expectation, more broadly distributed. Well, I can write it and send it to you all. But that's a principle that starting with Smith, going all the way to the economists of the present, including Marx, that's a principle that they all implicitly deny. Joel, that's a principle you are implicitly denying. It may be true, or it may be false, it may be important or may be unimportant. But I happen to think it's both plausibly true and plausibly important. And Joel, it will change your analysis if you come to agree with it.
Okay, so I think that's a challenge. Let's invite Joel to come to the symposium that I just put in the chat in a few months' time. If you wish to, Joel, you'll get a different perspective from Robert's lifetime's work. Thank you very much. I'm very keen to invite Robert and Kerry, the two interns at TTF, to have a chance to say anything. Robert, let's go to you. Say something if you'd like to, even if it's just to make a nice comment about the movie itself. Robert, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, firstly, thank you for giving the opportunity to watch the film. I think it was really powerful, really compelling. I liked the balance of the optimism at the end. I thought that was a good way to end it. I'm not sure how much more time for discussion there is, but I'd be interested to know, because it's not something I've fully understood from the film, about the power dynamic between corporations, essentially. So the film presented a picture of these transnational corporations at the very top, like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and all of the other big players, and whether the problem is in part this imbalance of power between, you've got these really, really big corporations, and if their power were to be reined in somewhat and there were a more equal playing field among corporations, would that be more better off? Or is the diagnosis of these top corporations applicable to smaller ones as well, if that makes sense?
Thank you, Robert. Lovely. And we'll go to Kerry, then we'll bounce back to Joel. Kerry, to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to sort of say the same thing as Robert, really, just how interesting, and I'm really grateful to have seen the film. It was talking about a lot of themes that I'm quite passionate about myself. I come from like a sociological background, so that's my sort of understanding of it so far. I just made some notes about the relationship between democracy and government and these corporations. I think for young people especially, there's a lot of distrust for both institutions, and the collusion and corruption that they have between them makes like a really difficult challenge for the solution. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that specifically, but thank you again.
Lovely. Okay, great stuff, folks. Thank you very much indeed, Robert and Kerry and Michael and everyone that's spoken. Joel, back to you, sir. I think we'll be wrapping up in about 5 or 10 minutes, if that's okay with you and everyone else. Joel, back to you.
I'd love to answer Robert Ashford more, but unfortunately, when he was stating that all-important principle, the Wi-Fi dropped out and I didn't hear it. So I'm going to join the symposium so that we can engage. My experience says that I usually find that disagreements are far less acute than they at first appear among intelligent, well-minded, and well-intentioned people. And I have a sense that that would be the case with Robert. I put the word good in quotes in my book title, implying that I'm not necessarily saying truly good corporations are a problem, but we could talk more about that and his principle. In terms of the power dynamic, Robert II, among corporations, I think it's really important. And again, these points are easier made in a book than a film, but it's really important that I define the terrain that I'm working in. The terrain I'm working in is the large, publicly traded, for the most part, transnational company, including financial institutions. And I draw a major distinction between that group of companies and, say, non-publicly traded companies and smaller businesses that happen to be incorporated. I think that the legal dynamics that are at the root of my analysis have to do with the fiduciary relationship between shareholders and managers and directors. The company that made my film is incorporated. The City of London is incorporated. There are all kinds of different ways that the corporation device is used. But I am talking about the problem, as I see it, for democracy lies with the substantial power of the very large players who are publicly traded and operate on a transnational scale. And in terms of relationships among and between corporations, you're absolutely right, Robert. One example is Twitter, which is a very big corporation, has told the corporation that made my film that it refuses to promote tweets about my film. Yes, we've been censored by Twitter. So that is a dispute that's happening between two corporations, albeit very different corporations. And for me, the problem is not my corporation. The problem is Twitter and the immense power that it holds to decide what can and can't be said. In regard to that, I urge you to keep your ears open over the next couple of weeks because there may be some media around that issue. And in terms of the distrust that Caradwin, is that how to say your name? That you talk about, you're absolutely right. I mean, the real problem is that at this moment, the idea of true, robust democratic government is much more an ideal than a reality. And it's an ideal rather than a reality because, as you point out, there's so much collusion and corruption that goes on between government and the large corporations that we're looking at. There's the rise of right-wing populism. There are so many reasons to be despairing and distrustful of government, and very tangible reasons. And so I guess what my work is about is saying, let's not give up on that ideal of true democratic government. In fact, let's fight for it. Because on the other side, the ideal of a kind of benevolent corporation running society is one that I'm very, very scared about. Is one that firstly, I don't trust that the benevolence will have holding power once government is out of the way or diminished. And second, I think that history shows that even the most benevolent despotic leaders, some kings in England or France that happen, or Denmark that happen to be wonderful monarchs and all of that, when institutions are despotic, when they aren't accountable, when they're not responsible to the people, they simply can't be trusted in the long term. Bad things happen. They always have. History shows it time and time again. So I believe, and this is a fundamental premise, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this principle is wrong, to quote Robert talking about his principle. But my principle is that it was a great advance in the post-Enlightenment period to develop these institutions of democratic governance. It was a great advance. They've never worked the way that they're supposed to be working, but the idea of giving up on that project sends chills up my spine because the alternative is despotic rule. So the only way forward I see, and this is why the film ends as it does, is to try to reclaim that ideal, to try to reclaim those institutions, try to make them work the way they should. At a very concrete, pragmatic level, that means, for example, laws that restrict the amount of money corporations can provide to political parties or the amount of influence they have in lobbying. I mean, there are very concrete steps we can take that don't involve these sort of utopian kinds of projects. And some of what is going on with some of the politicians we feature, and I would dare to say even what Joe Biden is beginning to do with, for example, his floor tax program and his antitrust announcements. These are baby steps, but what they show is a belief in the ideal of democratic governance rather than movement away from that ideal. And Caradwin, I mean, that's really all that I can offer. I can't say, tomorrow democracy is going to work perfectly. We have to fight for it to work perfectly. But I think we're in a good place to wage that battle. And I actually think a lot of young people are starting to jump onto that, especially in terms of local politics, even if not national politics.
Fantastic. We're going to go to Richard Emery, then we're going to go to anyone that's got something that's itching to say, then we'll bring matters to a close. Richard, briefly introduce yourself, make your point nice and succinctly, then we'll go to anybody else that has something that itching to say. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. Absolutely amazing, challenging film. Thank you, Joel, for all the work that you've put into bringing that together. Very briefly, I'm an ambassador for the Transparency Task Force. I have a particular focus on looking at the issues of authorised push payment fraud and everything that sits around that. So my real interest is in the failing of the UK banking system. It was Stuart Woolard's comment that caused me to put my hand up, because he wrote, companies cannot be left to define what is responsibility or good for themselves. This has to be set independently. I want to flag this up that 2 years ago, the UK banking system offered to self-regulate by introducing the contingent reimbursement model. As Andy will be well aware, that has actually simply demonstrated that they won't even adhere to their own rules. So we have a couple of the 10 companies that have signed up where they're actually reimbursing less than 10% of the claims that are made against them. So clearly they're not driven by any sort of adherence to their own code of practice that they've written, but they're focusing on not wanting to cut their profits and directors' bonuses. The Financial Conduct Authority appears unwilling to publicly regulate financial services because of the revolving door of senior managers. And actually, if we look back to the RBS Global Restructuring Group, an analysis of that as came about from an amazing symposium that Andy chaired a little while ago, demonstrated that it was actually the government that was one of the major drivers behind the wickedness of that Global Restructuring Group. So it's a mess.
Revolving doors are a big problem. Self-regulation is a big problem. To my mind, Richard, these are all manifestations of a system that will inherently default to doing what the system has been designed to do, which is to make profit at the expense of pretty much everything else. This is the fundamental that we've got.
And if I can just say, I spent the early part of my career working for John Lewis Partnership. And of course, that was a true partnership. And that was amazing to actually see how a true, genuine partnership, where the ultimate ownership of it was actually with the people that worked in the business. And that was amazing. The trouble is, it takes years and years to construct something like that. It's really difficult. You can't just make it happen overnight. So thanks, Andy. Thanks, Joel.
Thank you. When we go back to Joel for his final comments, after we've listened to Ed, Joel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether it's realistic to hope that more cooperatives and more mutuals and more multi-stakeholder organisations could in some way be encouraged into the system. But let's go to Ed first in Nova Scotia, Canada. Ed, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I just as another Canadian want to express my thanks to Canadian for this excellent film and the work that he's been doing in this field. My anger during the film came mostly against the government for the failures that we have taken, not only in this country, in failing to properly regulate the corporations and have them do what they justly should do. These corporations, to me, bear no blame. The blame goes to the people who run them and the people who own them. But they are not suffering for the injuries that their corporations have been doing to the society or to the environment. And so I don't really blame corporations as much as I blame people. People get the benefits from corporations. Those people should pay for the injuries caused by the corporations. And thanks again for a wonderful film.
Absolutely outstanding. Thank you so much for all the participation tonight, of course, for Joel as well. Before I pass to Joel to quite literally make the final comments, can we please show our appreciation? Remember, not just for tonight's session, not just for the making of the movie, but also the original corporation documentary, the books, the lifetime's work. I think, ladies and gentlemen, my personal view is we've had an opportunity to tap into the thought leadership of a remarkably progressive and forward-thinking and enlightened man. And what came across for me tonight was a real, frankly, a real passion behind the thinking. The passion and the intellect is a potent combination. Let's show our appreciation to Joel, please, everybody. Thank you very, very much indeed. That was outstanding. That was outstanding. By the way, I've watched your documentary twice, Joel, and on neither occasion have I got through it without crying at one point or another. It really does hit me hard. in the nicest and most constructive way possible. Joel, your final thoughts, sir.
Well, I just want to thank you all, and again, not just for your participation today, but for all the work you do, and for Andy for all the work he does and for arranging this. And in terms of his question about cooperatives and mutuals, yes, those are part of the piece here. But what we really have to do is everybody here is working in a different piece of this, trying to make corporations better. It's not a bad thing in itself. Trying to get politics to be democratic, going in the streets, protesting, organizing cooperatives, mutuals. These are all tools that we can use to make a much better society and an economy that actually helps society and helps work within a democratic kind of system and society. So all the work is good work. What we really need to do, though, is to resist this idea that some of it is necessarily going to take us in the right direction at the expense of other. I mean, that is my fundamental message, is do not give up on democracy. Do not follow the Pied Pipers of the new corporation movement that are asking us to do that. I don't think that's anybody here. I don't think it's necessarily the case that if you're working to make corporations better, you're seeing them as a substitute for government. Exhibit A is in Stuart's comment in the chat. So I am not saying that. So my only message here is really don't drink that Kool-Aid that political citizenship doesn't matter anymore, as Richard Edelman put it. In fact, what we really need to be fighting for, as much as more than, I think, making corporations better, is making government democratic. I think from all of that, the rest will follow. Believing that democratic governance in a very robust way, including of corporations and markets, is the way forward. That's my message.
Oh, wonderful, 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 wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, when we circulate the notes from the chat tomorrow, my colleague Alexandra will include the Twitter handle for the new corporation. Please use social media. Everyone go nuts for 10 minutes on social media tomorrow. Raise awareness of the movie. Somehow we can harness the power of social media to raise awareness a little bit. And who knows who knows which youngster we might just help to shape the thinking of, and who knows what effect they might have in years to come. Joel, did you have your hand raised there?
I just want to add one more thing, because a lot of people in the chat said, how can we see the movie? All of that stuff.
Yeah.
If you know anybody in the world of film distribution or broadcast distribution, we're currently working in the US, Europe, UK, around the world. We've sold the rights in, I think, Italy and Israel, but we're really trying to get this film out through the mainstream channels of distribution. And so, you know, if you want to whisper in the ear of anybody you know in those domains, tell them about the film. That would be amazing.
Wonderful. On that very, very, very positive note, let's approach the next stage of this particular narrative with a sense of community and a sense of commitment, and frankly, a sense of understanding that the cause here is both noble and very, very necessary. Even if we can't do a bleeding thing that's going to make a blind bit of difference in our lifetimes, frankly, let's think of our kids and grandkids, because if it gets screwed up big time now, it may take a couple of generations or longer for it to get back on the track. So let's stop it. Let's stop the train coming right off the tracks. We probably haven't got much time to do that. Let's do what we can. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much indeed. And once again, let's put our hands together to show our appreciation, not just for Joel and his work, but for everybody for contributing tonight. It's been great. It really has been great. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we'll wrap it up there. We'll wrap it up there, guys. Thanks a lot. Good night, all. Good night. Cheerio. Have a good day.